Welcome to Coffee with Kelly. I'm your host, Ethan Woodman, Product Marketing Specialist for Crisis Go, and I'm joined by my colleague, Kelly Moore, School Safety Analyst for Crisis Go. In today's episode, we'll discuss the importance of scenario-based training for staff and the three primary delivery mechanisms for training and assessing staff. We'll explore the benefits and drawbacks of each methodology, emphasizing the importance of scenario-based training. We'll also discuss the 10-step process for initiating drills, including developing a scenario to base the drill on. Additionally, we'll touch on the 3 stages of disaster response and how reducing the reactionary gap can increase the chances of survival in a crisis situation. Finally, we'll explore how improving critical thinking, problem solving, and situational awareness skills can save lives in a crisis. So stay tuned as we delve more into school safety. Good morning, Kelly.
Good morning.
How are you doing today?
I'm well. This is a good day. Lots of things has happened.
So last week we talked about training. We talked about setting up a necessary training schedule, what's needed in your schedule, who needs to be in the training program. You discussed 4 basic elements of a good training program, which was subject matter, training, demonstration, observation.
Yep.
Did I hit those right?
You did? Yep.
Cool. So then we're going to dive a little bit deeper now into the demonstration and observation phases.
Yeah. Well put.
All right.
Yeah. So last week we talked about the plans, right? The training plan and schedules and your emergency operations plans, and that your emergency operations plans set the foundation for everything else that you do. And now we have to transition into, we have to teach people how to do it, and we need to continue that process. And we do that by telling them what we want them to do, teaching them, training them. Then we have to demonstrate to them what we are expecting they do. And then we have to let them do it and observe and make sure that they are doing it in a manner in which we believe they should, with fidelity to the plan. And so, we set up the training plan. So the assumption here is that you know what your plans are, and that you have been told what your plans are and you've trained on them. And now we have to take the next step where somebody is demonstrating to us that they understand what is expected of them. So now we're talking about drills and exercises and setting those up. We're also going to talk at the latter part of this is situational awareness and what that really means to people when we use it, and why, in some regards, I believe this is the most important skill somebody can have to save their lives and the lives of others. And we'll get into that a little bit. But this first part, we're going to talk about the drills and exercises and what those are. And we're talking about drills, tabletop exercises, and full-scale exercises.
So what is the difference between drills and these exercises?
Good question. There is a difference, and there's not a difference. So they're alike in many ways, and they're different in many ways. So a drill is an exercise, but a drill exercises a small segment of an overall emergency response. So this is where last week we talked about the plans and the training to get people into an emergency protective action. And those are, as the I Love You Guys foundations put out there, are the standard response protocols, the lockdown, the secure, the evacuation, the shelter, and the hold. Those are the 5. And I can't think of any situation where one or a combination of those 5 emergency protective actions can't apply to a response to an emergency. So generally speaking, they are what you're trying to do in a drill. You're trying to get people to understand what that emergency protective action is and how to execute that. So it's a small segment. We're not talking about the hours that you might spend in an actual emergency. So you might practice a lockdown drill that takes maybe 10, 15, 20 minutes. You get everybody in there and, as the I Love You guys said, locks, lights, out of sight. So you want everyone behind locked doors with the lights and shades turned down and off, and everyone's silence and out of the sight of the window. So that's a valid lockdown. But we practice that for 4 or 5 minutes, maybe 15, 20 minutes on the long side of that. But in an actual emergency, there are things that are happening that will take much longer. Like you're searching for somebody. You're searching for the perpetrator. You're trying to attend to people who have been injured. You are managing the incident. So we had an incident at one of my schools where there was a man who was seen on campus with what a student thought was a gun. And we solved that issue very quickly as emergencies go. And that was resolved within an hour and a half. We don't ever train people for sitting for an hour and a half. We train them what we want them to do and say, okay, now if this was a real emergency, you might be here for a long time, right? And we resolve that because just so happens it wasn't a gun, but we resolved it by the fact that we ran the license plate of the car that he was in, and we knew from the sheriff's department, we knew who he was, and we had his phone number, and we called him to resolve it. So drills are to practice a small segment. You might practice different segments of different drills at different times and not just the emergency protective. You might have a lockdown and then evacuate the classes after the lockdown and move through that, right? A tabletop exercise is generally, as the name suggests, is you have a small group of people, typically your emergency team, your safety teams. You sit at a table and you run a scenario using your safety team who is expected to manage the incident. And they would sit down and they would run a tabletop, and they could run into, smaller segments of that emergency, or they could run all the way through from start to finish, and they can do that relatively quickly. I can do several scenarios, and I've done it where we're running 2, 3, 4 different scenarios in an hour, hour and a half, because what we're doing is trying to get people to start thinking about different scenarios or the same scenario different ways. So tabletops, probably one of the most underutilized methods for training people, especially your safety teams that's out there. And I wish people would use these much more often, because these tabletops are generally done in a very safe environment, and you can change the roles very quickly. So somebody who's maybe the incident designated as the incident commander during the first run through might be the operations person in the second one, and move it through so that you're training people who are on the safety team to take over a role that they're not typically assigned to, but the person who's supposed to do that role may not be there. So you can do that, and you can train your whole safety team in a relatively short period of time. And when I say underutilized, most people don't do them. They don't understand them. So they think they're these big monstrous things, and they're really not once you get the hang of them. But if I were king, I would make these people once a week, twice a month, at least once a month. And we'll go into that when we start looking at breaking down how to do drills later. And then the final one is the full scale exercise. These are big productions. Many states require them, and many states fall short of the requirement in that they require maybe the schools to do active shooter drills or fire drills, full-scale fire drills once or twice a year. But they failed to mandate those same drills be done by the fire department and the schools or the law enforcement. Oftentimes there's, well, you may be required to do that, but we're not. So we have a manpower shortage, so we can't participate. Well, you have to. This says they have to. That says you have to, not me. Right? So sometimes there's this disconnect, and we work through that. But the reason that people are afraid of them is they do take a lot of planning. They can be expensive because you're talking about doing these large-scale exercises, likely outside of school hours. So maybe on a Saturday or a Sunday, or a teacher in service day. So there's this effort that needs to go on. So, but they're very useful. They do take a lot of planning, a lot of coordination, a lot of communication, a lot of training, because you should train people up to that exercise, the people who are participating, so they understand what the expectations are. And so you train them and you have them work through this process. And this is going to be typically an all-day exercise. Sometimes I've done them where they were a little bit scaled down and we did two separate half days in the same day so we could get more people through. So that's possible, but it takes a lot of training and leading up to that, a lot of coordination and sometimes expense. So people kind of shy away from those.
Question for you, Kelly. So we're talking about how schools and districts are mandated to conduct the drills. So who's really responsible for the objectives during that?
So I think what you're asking is, do the states mandate or define success for a drill?
Correct.
Right. So what objectives are being met? Who sets the goals? And really at the state level, generally speaking, there is an assumption that everyone should know what they're doing. So we can talk about the assumptions, but generally speaking, it falls on the district and the safety coordinators and or whoever is in charge or responsible for the safety of your schools officially. It's up to them to set the goals and objectives for each drill and whether or not they are met. And if they're not met, why and how do we correct that? So the state might say you have to do a fire drill monthly, but they don't tell you what that is. So you could get into that situation where schools are trying to do it as quickly as possible without really looking at the objectives. It's rarely is it an objective. Let's see how fast you can complete this drill.
Right. That's not a healthy objective.
That's not a valid objective.
Right.
Unless you want to say, how fast can we do this and get it correct? Because time is an issue when we're talking about emergency protective actions. Time is an issue. But we don't want to speed through something at the cost of the fidelity to the plan. And so time rarely is a valid, because we just don't know how long that's going to take. And so if you're rushing and you're focused on trying to get this done quickly as opposed to correctly, then you're going to miss steps that you should have taken. Time is an issue, but it's when you're talking about drills, we're talking about training you how to do it correctly. And if you look at some of the training techniques, slow is smooth, smooth is fast, right? So if you take your time and you work through those processes and you train your muscles and your mind how to do something slowly, then when you need it, it's there and you can do it quickly. So we need to get it correct when we're not under a time crunch, and we're more likely to get it correct when we are under a time crunch if it's needed.
All right, Kelly. So you've talked about drills, the two different types of exercises. So what are some steps that we can take to actually start conducting these drills?
So there are several steps that need to occur. First, we need to understand, again, setting your schedule and putting your schedule into motion is a process. The first time you do this, it'll take a lot of effort because you have to think through everything and it won't be natural to you. But like everything else, it's a skill that we're learning. And as we get into that process, we will get into a rhythm. This schedule will be difficult and time consuming to set up the first time to make sure that you include everything that needs to be there. But next year, it'll be set for you. You just have to figure out who's going to do what. But that schedule can be used year after year because you're going to drill and train the same stuff to mostly the same people. So there will be some things that change, and we'll get into that because I think drills should be scenario-based, and we'll talk about developing scenarios. But it really takes a little bit of effort to begin with, and then once we get into that rhythm, it becomes pretty straightforward and pretty simple for us. So you need to start with all of your training plans. We need to develop that schedule so everyone publish the schedule. I don't like to tell a school when they can do a drill or when they should do a drill. I tell them for the month of January, we're going to do this drill. The scenario kind of limits when they can do it because I set a time of day in that scenario, and I'll tell you why we do that in a little bit. So they can pick the day that's least disruptive for their school, but they can't pick the time of day because it's part of the scenario. Sometimes I give them options, and like I said, I'll go into that in a little bit. You need to develop the scenario that you're going to use. And when we talk about scenarios, we're talking about a set of circumstances, a storyline that is meant to trigger the emergency protective action that you are drilling for. Lockdown, evacuation. So I don't like to call things fire drills or active shooter drills. I like to call them lockdown drills, evacuations, shelter, secure, and hold. I like to use those terms. This is the type of drill that we're doing so that everyone knows, regardless of what scenario that I'm giving you, I want you to exercise this emergency protective action. So a scenario should trigger that. Sometimes I have them trigger multiple actions, maybe a lockdown and an evacuation, maybe a secure to a lockdown, maybe a hold, maybe a lockdown to a hold. So I like to mix them up that way. But again, I like people to understand that this is a safe environment. We're going to reduce the stress. We're not going to have this high stress environment because I want you to learn. I want you to train. So I'm going to communicate with people. I'm going to tell them, hey, we're going to do this drill during this month. As that's coming up, I'm going to give them one of two, maybe both of these things. I'm going to give them, hey, we're going to do a lockdown drill in the month of September. I might even give them the materials and or training to make sure that they understand what that is, some refresher training. Understand what it is we're going to test. They may not know the scenario, but they know that, hey, we're going to have a lockdown, and generally they have an idea of what that means. I like to remind people of their expectations and their responsibilities because we have different levels of that. So I want people to understand that the drill is meant to drive and meet these expectations and goals so that they can demonstrate they understand what their responsibilities are. I like to have evaluators. It's amazing how well a school reports that they did when they self-evaluate.
What would be a good example of a designated evaluator?
It could be your safety official, like I did that for several schools. It could be a fire department if you're evaluating a fire drill. It could be a law enforcement if you're doing a lockdown, or in some cases a fire drill, right? Because I don't automatically evacuate as soon as I hear a fire alarm. I take a quick assessment to figure out if somebody pulled the fire alarm for the purpose of targeting my students. So I do an assessment. So you might have law enforcement help you with your fire drill for that specific purpose. That being said, you need to make sure the fire department and the police department or sheriff's office, whatever it is in your area, that they're on the same sheet of music so they're not conflicting right there. Because there are some fire guys that absolutely think that that's the wrong way to go, but I can argue that it's not. But yeah, a week or so ahead of time, I like to have a run through with the safety teams, tabletop. I like to say, okay, we're going to have a fire drill next week. Let's make sure we understand what we're doing so that we can evaluate honestly what our expectations are and whether or not our teachers and our other staff are doing what they're supposed to do. A day or so before the team, let's look at our site. Let's look at, is there anything that's going to prohibit us from doing that drill? Maybe there's a facilities issue and there's going to be some construction and we just can't, it's not a good time to run the drill. So let's evaluate whether or not it's a good time. Maybe I as a safety coordinator, set the drill during a testing week. And again, not a good time for that drill. Could something happen during a testing week? Sure. But you don't need to simulate that and mess up the performance of mandatory standardized testing, that kind of stuff. After everything is said and done, you need to do an after action review. You need to talk to your participants, your teachers, your custodians, your staff. Yes, they need to practice that as well. It's not just for the teachers, it's for everybody, which is something that was new to my district. We don't have to do that. Yes, you do. And this is why. And it's because they're part of our staff. They're part of people who, one, may be responsible for kids because whatever's happening is happening during lunchtime, or there was a lockout and one of the kids didn't make it back to the classroom before the doors were locked. And now you need to get that kid somewhere and there's a custodian who says, come with me or I'll get you in here, right? However that works. But you need to ask them to participate, do a quick survey. Google Forms is great for that, where you can ask, what went well? What do we need to work on? What questions do you have? What do you think we need to do to improve that kind of stuff? All right. So that's kind of the elements of what you need to include in the run up and the execution of those drills.
Kelly, so you've talked about scenarios. Why is it important that we run scenario-based drills?
To put it simple, rarely does anything happen with an announcement. There's something that triggered the need to get into an emergency protective action. We have to start training our teachers to look for these behaviors, these incidences, these things, these circumstances that would cause us to think about how we respond when we respond. So the way that we do this, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, there's basically five emergency protective actions that are out there: lockdown, secure, evacuation, shelter, and hold. They can be used for multiple different scenarios. So I can practice a lockdown without having an active shooter. Why is that important? Because there's this conversation going around about how stressful an active shooter is to drill for. But I can drill that same protective action if I have a suspicious subject who entered campus and we don't know why they're there or what they're doing. So we can initiate a lockdown without one fatality, without one injury. We think there's a guy on campus with a gun. Now what? Do a lockdown. Okay, we found him. It wasn't a gun. Let's move on with our day, right? So we need to do that. We need people to start recognizing their surroundings and when they should initiate an emergency protective action. My opinion, that any adult should be able to initiate any protective action when they feel like there's a need to. But in order for us to do that, we have to train that, because the culture in schools is everything has to run through the principal first. And that takes sometimes minutes before some action is taken, before 911 is called. But if we can do that quickly, we can assess, we can get people into the protective action very quickly, and then we can assess the need to continue with that. We can buy time to investigate what's going on, what did they see, that type of stuff. But you really need to get into that emergency protective action. So we need to start teaching people what to look for. And this goes into, our next topic, and that's situational awareness and what that really entails. So if we don't teach people to look for scenarios and things that might trigger that emergency protective action alert, then we're going to be behind the curveball or the 8 ball on every incident. And what we're really trying to do is get ahead of that.
So what is situational awareness, Kelly, in this realm of school safety?
So I'm going to take it outside of the realm, because this is one of those life skills that can save your life, keep you safe no matter where you're at. And situational awareness is, simply put, it's understanding what is happening around you, being aware of what people are doing, what that means, how does it impact your safety. We talked about this early on about asking and infusing safety into everything that we do in our schools. Now, situational awareness is just that, is infusing safety in everything that you do. How does crossing the street affect or impact my safety? Well, if I just walk out into traffic, it's going to have a pretty big impact. But if I'm aware of what's happening, I'm going to significantly reduce that ability for traffic to impact my safety. We talked about that one case where I had an associate of mine who called about deputy almost hit him in a crosswalk. He was not necessarily aware of what was happening. He was not aware of this police car driving fast and not slowing down. He was surprised by that. You shouldn't be surprised about what's happening. There are things that are happening all around us all the time. And I'll give you an example. Just the other day, my wife and I are the proud parents of 3 very large dogs. That requires us to go get food very often, literally once, maybe a little bit more than once a week.
Wow.
We have to run in to grab food for the beasts. I pulled into the parking lot for the pet shop, and as soon as I got out, I heard a series of gunshots.
What?
It was rapid succession gunshots.
Oh my goodness.
And so I stop, I assess what's going on. I look over, and there's a guy across the way from me, and he says, "Were those gunshots?" And I said, "Yes, they were." "Are you sure?" "Yes, I am." I saw no other indicators of what was going on. I knew where they were coming from, and between me and those gunshots was a large shopping center. So I'm saying, all right, I'm not impacted by this. Somebody else is, but I'm not. So I went around and got dog food, put them back in my vehicle, and came home. Nothing happened. But we knew what was happening. And so this impacts your everyday life, what's going on. become familiar with things that can cause you danger in your area. In California, if I heard a gunshot, that was bad news. One, because I was likely, at the time that I hear these noises, these shots, I was probably a law enforcement officer at the time, right?
Yep.
If I heard something, I reported it. Hey, I hear shots coming from this area. Are you getting any other calls? Have you any other indicators of what's going on? No? Yes? We're receiving calls, that kind of thing. In fact, that's what occurred when I was involved as the incident commander in an active shooter situation. I didn't hear gunshots, but I heard just siren after siren after siren headed past my house, which was a couple miles away from where this incident occurred. So I called up and I said, what's going on? And they explained, we just had an active shooter. And I said, okay, I'm en route. But I was aware of that. So now I'm taking action. In California, if I hear shots, it's one thing. It means something to me. When I came to Virginia a few months back, I'm hearing gunshots all the time. And I'm like, what is going on here? Well, I live in the country where people shoot guns. They have targets on their land and they shoot guns all the time. They hunt on their land. And now gunshots from my house mean very little to me. But when I'm in town and I hear gunshots, a whole different ballgame, right? So that's situational awareness, understanding what's happening. How do we get there? How do we look at improving our situational awareness? Well, first of all, universally, quit walking with your face in your phone.
That's a good one.
Right? So observe, look at what's happening in your surroundings. Assess your environment. Continually assess your environment. If you need to answer a phone call or look at a text, then walk over to a safe area and do it there. Take the time, focus on what you're doing, and then get back into moving down the sidewalk. Don't look at your stuff, your phone and stuff while you're driving. That's not being situationally aware. That's why we have so many fatal accidents while people are texting and talking on their phone, is they're not focused on what they're doing.
I always get so mad when I see people
Right.
driving and you look over and they've got a phone. They're just looking at their phone.
Right.
There was one time I looked over and I kid you not, this lady had a full-fledged iPad in front of her.
Yep.
Like a borderline TV screen in front of her while she was driving.
Yep.
I'm like, I'm going to move as far away from you as possible.
Right. Right. But so you're aware of that. Now,
Oh, yeah.
So you're always asking the question. What's the worst that could happen? With what I'm seeing, what's the worst that could happen? 99% of the time, nothing's going to happen. The worst thing that could happen is I could trip or whatever, right? And whatever the worst thing that could happen is usually self-inflicted. But there are things that are abnormal. So you need to understand what the baseline is. And that's why I gave you the story for California and Virginia. The baseline is completely different in California than it is in Virginia, where I live. But the baseline for somebody being in a populated area is, wow, that's gunshots. There shouldn't be gunshots here. There's no place other than a shooting range where it's safe to discharge a firearm within a city. So something's happening. Understand what a gunshot sounds like, right? So control your focus and your attention. If you're trying to get somewhere, pay attention to what's happening around you. And if something is outside of that baseline, expected behaviors, then you need to be aware of the potential for that danger. You need to evaluate that. And what we're trying to do here is, real quickly, is we're trying to get people to work through what has been called the decisive or human response to disaster and crisis. And we all heard of the flight, fight, or freeze syndrome. Well, there was a a young lady back in, I think it was 2008, by the name of Amanda Ripley, who studied that. And she said it's much more than flight, fight, or freeze. There's something going on in the human response to these disasters and emergencies. And what it is when we see something happening, we want to deny that it's going to be harmful naturally. But what we're doing there is we're trying to determine and evaluate what is happening in front of us and compare that to our experiences. And if our experiences don't include things of danger, then we are likely going to deny that that is dangerous to us because we just don't have that experience. We're going to then try to compare it to what we do have experience, car backfiring as an example, or glass breaking, or, why does little Johnny have a gun? I've never seen little Johnny have a gun on campus. Oh, he's in the drama. He must be bringing that as a prop to the drama club. They must be doing some sort of play where they needed a prop, when in fact he has a gun. And so we try to do that. But once you go out of that denial phase, you come into the deliberation. And now you say, well, Johnny really shouldn't have that gun. This is dangerous. What am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to tell somebody? Am I supposed to hit the panic button? What am I supposed to do? So there's this deliberation phase and trying to figure out how you are supposed to respond. And once you get into that and you just said, this is what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to press the button, the panic button, because Johnny has a gun. And so they call that the decisive moment. And that is the time that you take some sort of action, the action that you just deliberated. And why is that important to us? Because in order for us to increase our chances of survival, we have to get into that decisive moment phase when we are going to take action. We know that when you take that action, the sooner and the quicker that you take that action during an event, the chances of your survival are significantly increased. So let's talk about that real quick. That means from the time that you see something happening to the time that you make a decision, the shorter that period is, the better our chances of survival. You have to go through all three of those phases. So this is where being situationally aware, understanding the potential and working through those. If you see something and you immediately identify that as something as danger, you've passed the denial phase. If you know what to do when you see Johnny with a gun, you don't have to deliberate. You already know. So you hit the button. So this is the difference between somebody who sees something and waits several minutes to somebody who sees the exact same thing, who is situationally aware of what's going on. They have the experience, they have the training, they've worked through these drills. I see that person with a gun. I don't care who he is. I'm going to press this button. A matter of seconds, right? And so we understand that and we can take quicker action. And in the real world, I can be walking down the street with my wife and I said, you know what? This isn't a safe place for us to be. We need to move, or we need to stop where we're headed and change our direction, or we need to turn around and go back home or whatever, right? So in order for us to really be situationally aware, we need to make sure that we have that ability. And this is what we call the reactionary gap, where we see something to the point where we do something. But we have to walk through all three of those phases quickly. And the time that we shave off that, we can reduce that reactionary gap to seconds as opposed to minutes if we don't know what we're doing.
That could be the difference between a life or death situation, seconds or minutes.
It can mean that the difference between your life and many lives,
Mm-hmm.
right? Not just one. If you see something and you say, I need to take action right now, you can save many lives, not just your own. So that's why I think being situationally aware and understanding this response, human response to disasters and crisis, is probably one of the most important things that we can do to not only save our own lives, but save the lives of others. Because we can start, if we recognize something or we're not quite sure, we can start asking ourselves the questions. Okay, that guy's acting strange. What's the worst that could happen? What is he doing? Well, the worst that could happen is he's got a gun. Well, if he comes out with a gun or he starts to get violent in some other means, I'm going to do this. And maybe he's not there yet. Maybe he's just nervous and he's just getting the adrenaline pumping because he's about to do something. And this is where you can start working on going through those phases before anything happens, so that when he turns around and you see a large knife or you see a weapon, you can say, I'm out of here. And you can respond very quickly to what's happening in front of you.
A great part about this segment is that this doesn't just apply to schools. This can apply to any situation, as you've been talking about. Because while school shootings are obviously horrific, they actually don't happen as often as like more workplace violence. So this is really important to really start training and learning, because you can apply it to every aspect of your life.
That's correct. And especially as parents, we have a responsibility to keep our families safe.
That's very true.
And this is where you take that responsibility serious and you take actions and you understand what's happening so you can protect your kids. I don't care if I come out of this alive or not. I mean, I do. I'd prefer coming out of it alive. But my primary goal is my family and making sure I protect my family. We talked about this when I go to a restaurant and I sit with my face and front facing forward, into the entrance to the restaurant, my back to the wall, looking forward. It's not for me. It's to protect my family. I know where the exits are. Not for me. It's for my family. You get out this way. This is where you go. I can start working through that. And my reaction time to anything that might happen is far less. And, we talked about this also. People said, well, why do you, that's so sad you have to live that way. I don't think it's sad at all. It's part of my job as a parent to protect my family. Part of my job as a husband and a father to protect those that I love. That's part of my job. I don't get paid for it, but that's part of my job. And I take that responsibility very seriously. So, I'm not in law enforcement now, but I still have those skill sets that allow me to do that, and that's developed. And I'm not going to just say, oh, that's not my job anymore, because it's still my job to protect my family. And that's what I do, whether they like it or not.
I bet it's pretty much second nature to you, though. You probably don't really have to think about thinking, if that makes sense.
That's absolutely correct. It's just second nature to me. So when people say, God, it's sad that you have to live that way, I don't even notice it. It's because it's so ingrained and it's so effortless. I just look at everything. We talked about when I say hi to everybody. I don't do it because I'm a nice guy and I want to be friends with them. I say hi so I know that they know that I know who they are. I've acknowledged them. They've acknowledged me. So if they were thinking about something, maybe they don't think about, maybe they change their mind and they don't do what they were thinking about doing because somebody pointed them out. Somebody said, hi. It's not really offensive to say hi to somebody.
No, well, not in most cases.
In most
no.
cases, right? Right. But it is important that we acknowledge people, we see them, and it is a very subtle way of saying, I see you. How are you? Oh, I'm good.
I bet you have a pretty firm handshake. Do you shake people's hands when you say hi to them?
Depends on the situation. But as I'm walking down the street, I don't do that.
Well, yeah, okay. That makes sense. They probably think you're trying to sell something to them. Well, Kelly, that was probably one of my more favorite blogs. I feel like I say that every time, but maybe give us a quick recap of what we've discussed thus far.
So in this podcast, we were talking about drills, exercises, and situational awareness and how they work together and what you're really trying to do. You're really trying to protect your students, your staff, people who are on your campus. You're really trying to do that. But it goes beyond that. It goes into your everyday life. And we talked about this reactionary gap, the denial phase, the deliberation phase, and the decisive action phase, decisive moment when you decide to take an action. We've talked about that. But if we understand all of those concepts, we understand what we do, we're gaining experience, we're gaining knowledge, we're understanding what we need to do so that we can, one, get people into an emergency protective action quicker. Two, you understand that what you're seeing has an impact on your safety. And if you understand what that impact is, you can generally take action before there's actually any negative consequences. If you understand that that person is about to come into your building and they're angry and they're holding a weapon and you understand what that means, you can get that emergency protective action initiated before they ever cross that threshold. And understanding that and translating that to your everyday life will make you a much safer person and increases your chances of survival substantially.
That's all for today's episode. We hope you found this discussion on training and assessing staff, the 3 stages of disaster response, and situational awareness informative and helpful. Remember, scenario-based training is crucial for staff to understand when and how to execute emergency protective actions. By reducing the reactionary gap through improving critical thinking, problem solving, and situational awareness skills, we can increase our chances of survival in a crisis situation. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. And if you have any questions about what we've discussed, leave a comment on our website at crisisgo.com. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on Coffee with Kelly, a discussion on school safety.